Humans of the cardboard, welcome back to Just Nuts, guys. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the OCG. They just had their most recent metagame report. This is, I believe, post-Duelist Nexus, so they've got some new cards there. A couple of new decks kind of rise up here a little bit, not a ton. And we're just seeing a couple of really interesting developments for them. So specifically, I'm not going to focus too much on this metagame report in particular, but I do want to talk about a couple of really interesting trends and tech cards that we're seeing a good bit in the OCG that I do think could translate to our version of the game, pretty much post-cybernetic or Cyberstorm access, which is really interesting. So, you know, obviously, from what they're looking at here, Purrely's the best deck in the game. I don't expect Purrely to be the not dominant force. It's obviously it's not getting a ton. It's not dominating the metagame like Tearlament did or anything, but it is the most represented deck overall. I'm expecting it to be decent. I'm not expecting it to be the best deck in the game for us, and maybe that's because we don't have a ban list yet, where we limit the power of Sprite, we limit the power of Runic, we limit the power of Kashtira, and then maybe Purrely sits there atop alone. But until we see that, I'm not going to, worry too much about that. Other than that, you have to keep in mind they are now moving into their Duelist Nexus format, whereas we are just coming into Cyberstorm Access format. So they're moving into the next format. We're moving into the one they've just been in for a little bit. So keep that stuff in mind. So yeah, scrolling down here, obviously there's a ton of really cool decks. I'm glad that Unchained actually has a good couple of tops here, which is really cool. I really want to see some of those deck lists. Purrely performing really well. One thing I want to highlight here is the engines, the packages that Purrely has been doing, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I have a couple cards I want to look at. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. I have a list of cards that I've been noticing in the OCG, and I think they're really worth talking about for what we could see here in the TCG. Ghost Reaper, one of the most interesting ones here to me. Every new wave of format, when we get a bunch of new decks, we always have to go through and look at Ghost Reaper, if it's worth it. Now keep in mind, you have to be able to allocate extra deck space for this card, and this card is one of those cards where you have to have the discussion, is it worth the -1, right? Because technically, this card, you're just losing a card from hand to limit the ceiling of your opponent's deck, essentially. And if it's impactful enough, it can be worth. But if it's not, you are just going -1 in the hand. So you got to consider that. But with Super Heavy Samurai running around, being able to hit the link 1 limits so many of their plays. It limits their ability to get Soul Piercer back on the field. They may get one search off of Soul Piercer, but they're not getting another one. Sometimes it hurts their flexibility. A lot of their 1-card combos, they need to go like summon and then link off for the link 1 early if they don't have immediate access to Wakushi. So that could maybe even completely deaden a hand as well. And overall, it does feel decently impactful versus them, as well as Purrely. Purrely just hitting Noir, saying, I'm taking away your biggest payoff for everything your deck does. Now your deck is just a Zeus deck. That is it. Everything else your deck does is so fair if we take away Zeus. Other than draw. They can still draw a bunch of cards, so you have to consider that. But if they're drawing a bunch of cards and they're still never able to get into anything really scary enough payoff-wise, you still may be okay and be able to actually come out on top. So I think those are the two biggest matchups. You can go here and there on some of the decks that already exist in our game. I don't think there's any one target in Sprite that's good enough. I don't think there's any... I mean, you could argue a Rise Heart for Kashtira. Maybe specifically if you play a deck that gets decimated by a Macrocosmos-like effect, then maybe you consider it. But I still think Kashtira does enough aside from a Rise Heart, where that's not always going to be the best option. And then, Runic, I guess you could hit Hugin, but they would have already had to commit a monster to the field, I believe. So if they're not starting with a Runic spell, then I guess it could be cool, but you're going to have to let them get to a Hugin out the gate, which is kind of unfortunate. But still interesting. Definitely worth the conversation. I think this one's a really interesting one. Moving on. Retaliating C. This one kind of similarly hits a couple different matchups pretty damn well. The first one, obviously, being Purrely. Purrely, every single one of their quick play spells lets you Retaliating C. It allows them to never get any of their spells engraved. If they don't get their spells engraved, they cannot do anything really. They're very, very limited. They have to open very specific hands, and even then, their ceiling's not going to be very high. This card straight up decimates them, for sure. I even think about stuff like Bee Trooper. This could be an argument to just if you're a rogue player, this single card by itself maybe I should just play Bee Trooper, because this card's insane in Bee Trooper. and in the format in general. Also, other couple decks worth noting. Kashtira technically can trigger with Theosis, but they don't really care about the macro effect. More so, I would look at Runic. Again, kind of same thing. They have all those quick play spells. You're pretty much guaranteeing they never end up in grave, which is insanely strong. As well as Branded is another one. It kind of depends on the build. But again, if you have another search target off of this, it could still be worth anyway, just to get more cards in rotation, get free bodies on the field. And if you're playing B-Trooper, you probably just have to play it because it's probably just too good not to. So a couple different matchups where this card's pretty dang good. Also, even Sprites, they play starter. So, I don't know. That's kind of fun, interesting as well. But, yeah, a lot of really interesting matchups where this card could be really, really solid in the format. Definitely worth considering. All right, moving on from there. Dimension Shifter. This is an interesting card. This card's not all over the place in the OCG, but I do think it's worth noting. We've not seen a ton of Dimension Shifter in this past format. The reason being, Kashtira doesn't care too much about it. Sprite doesn't care fully about it. There's some stuff it hurts on them, but like they can still do some stuff under it. As well as Branded. Like we said, if Branded isn't that hurt by Retaliating Sea, it's not hurt that much by Dimension Shifter. So, okay, I guess it's good versus Runic out of the top 4 decks in the format, but after that, you're just kind of like, okay. Labyrinth, another one that doesn't really care about it, if you want to throw that in as the 5th best deck in the game currently. So it just hasn't really had its time to shine, but if Runic's still good, Purrely comes through, same thing with Retaliating Sea. If Purrely can't get their spells engraved, they don't do much at all. And Super Heavy Samurai, they need to rotate Soul Piercer. They need to Reborn guys. They need to get stuff engraved. You severely, severely limit the capabilities of that deck. I think Shifter's great. Just be careful not to play into Gamma with it. With honestly a lot of these hand traps, be careful not to play into Gamma with it. But yeah, Shifter's actually pretty wild there. Moving on, DD Crow has been picking up play in the OCG. I think it's just one of those things where it's like a more consistent option. It can kind of hit a little something in everything. If your deck could play Shifter, you're like, okay, but what if I'm really scared of Super Heavy Samurai? Literally, or I'm sorry, not Shifter. I'm thinking Retaliating Sea. They don't trigger Retaliating Sea anything. They don't play any spells. So, if you're considering the 2 and maybe your deck doesn't want to play Shifter either, or something, I don't know, whatever. It's a more mid-rangey option. If you either can't afford to play like macro yourself, or you're worried Retaliating Sea isn't going to hit something like Super Heavy Samurai, you can shift to something like DD Crow that can still hit the Soul Piercer in grave, or some part of their combo in grave. This can still hit a quick play spell from Runic or Purrely to limit their ceiling. Certain things there. It hits almost everything for us in the TCG in some way, except I guess probably Kashtira really would be the one main one that isn't really hurt too hard from this card. But again, we're expecting a ban list, so we'll see what happens there. That could definitely limit them and make them a little bit less of a threat. But DD Crow seeing a little more play. I think it's the more consistent option. Bestials obviously have that higher ceiling, but they can't hit spells and traps, and they can't hit any attribute. Only Chaos attribute monsters. So DD Crow has a little bit of that flexibility to it that doesn't. Next up, Drone Lock. This has already been picking up play over the last couple weeks in the TCG. It's really good versus Super Heavy Samurai. It's really good versus a couple of other decks in the game already. It's just a card that limits the opponent's ceiling. We feel like we're at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where if your opponent goes unhindered turn 1, it's very hard to break their board. But if you can limit their ceiling, then with like 5 cards left in hand, you can break a half-built board or a 3/4 built board. Fully built board, pretty tough. And so that's what Droll is really good at, just limiting that penultimate ceiling. They can still do some stuff under it, but it's enough to make them very breakable. I like it. I think it's a good card. Purrely is one of those decks that don't really get hurt too much by this, so that's like one of the weird ones, but especially since they can do so much stuff in the draw phase, so that's kind of weird. But yeah, still really cool. Their Triple Tactics Thrust. This is a card that the OCG plays pretty regularly. And maybe it's just because of stuff like Max C. Everybody has Max C, but we're also seeing a little bit of an uptick in hand traps in the format as of late. The more hand traps there are, the better Thrust is, the better Talents is. But I see a lot of lists that don't even go hard on this card. They just like the one copy. If they see it, cool. It could just be an extra copy of like a bunch of different spells, maybe one power trap going first as like a potential blowout card, something like Dimensional Barrier or something like that. But still a really interesting card. They just play it way more than we do. We don't see anyone play this right now, and obviously reading the card, it's going to come up at some point. Small World. I like this one a lot. This card has been all over the OCG as of late. I think the argument for this card is like, yeah, it's a -1, okay, and you have to play weird cards sometimes to make sure you have the bridges for it. But I think just fundamentally in Yu-Gi-Oh!, as we progress further and further, we're going to have more and more powerful cards. So if we have to go -1 to start our turn, if we're getting a card that's a 1-card combo that goes +5, +6, it's worth it. Consistency is king. And also utility is king. The fact that you could get a 1-card starter, but if you already have a 1-card starter, you play, see where you get interrupted, and then you small world into the right extender to play through it at certain points. I think this card is great. I really think it's just kind of a daunting card for people to have to worry about building around it and having the right bridges. But a lot of times the bridges are just like hand traps, like totally playable cards anyway, that don't even really hurt your deck that much. Like maybe you have to play a slightly subpar card like Veiler over Imperm to have that monster connecting piece, or a Ghost Mourner or an Ogre, something like that. But I think it totally is very justifiable for the consistency and utility that this card adds to your deck. So I love this. I've been seeing it in a lot of different builds in the OCG. Very, very cool. Because I think this is one of the more fair search cards in the game, right? XYZ Encore. We're going to finish up with 2 more pieces talking about Purrely specifically. It's the best deck in the OCG. I'm expecting to be good. I'm just not expecting to be the best deck in the TCG out the gate. But it's still worth mentioning. XYZ Encore is a very interesting card. A lot of decks play it in the OCG right now, and I think there's one spot I land on this card with, and it is probably the single best card you can play versus Purrely going second. It's better than Kaiju's, especially since they're going to get to draw a bunch of cards before the Kaiju's even get to fire. The fact that this card cannot even be responded to means they cannot use the trap card to chain and dodge this card's effects. And resolve all their draws and everything. This card keeps them from getting to Purrely Noir. This card keeps them from getting, I believe, all of their draws. I don't think they get any draws if you fire this card at the correct moment at the beginning of your turn after you're going second versus Purrely. And yeah, I mean, that's basically it, right? You just keep them off of everything. They're not getting the shuffles off Noir. They're not getting the towers part of Noir. They're not getting Noir at all, actually. And you're keeping them from getting draws. A lot of time, the argument with Kaiju's that makes them just okay is, yes, you take care of the Noir, the interruptions, and the towers monster, but they still drew like a bunch of cards on your standby, so they may just have 3 hand traps at hand. You're not killing them, and they just have a ton of hand advantage to like come back on the next turn. You lose anyway. So I like Encore, but the downside of Encore, of course, is that outside of Purrely, like, it doesn't touch anything. So if you feel very, very scared of Purrely, or your deck has a really tough matchup, specifically going second versus Purrely, then I'd consider it. But if you're kind of back and forth, like, you can still mess with Retaliating C, that also has other matchups and can kind of cross-hit other decks. This card does not, though, so keep that in mind. And the last cards I want to talk about here is Shadal's. A little bit of a new development in the OCG as of late for Purrely. There's a bunch of different engines. If you go back to the Road to the King here and we look at Purrely, they love to play these side engines. And basically what it is a side engine that helps you make up the advantage you lose by having to discard for all of your quick play spells. If you resolve 2 to 3 of them in a turn, you're discarding 3 cards. You have to make that up somehow. And so this deck is choosing to play the Crystal Beast kind of package, where this card Engrave can banish itself to add a Crystal Beast monster and a field spell. So you get a field spell plus that. You get 2 cards off of that after discarding 1, which is great. But I think this one's a little bit bricky. This is once per duel, so once you do it once, it's dead. If you draw the monster, That's super awkward, right? So you don't want that. Yes, it'd be your discard, but like now you're not getting any value back off of your discards. We've seen the Dark World see play because you just discard Brawn, draw a card, discard Snow, search a Brawn, discard Brawn, draw a card. Whatever you want to do there. That one's more consistent and helps you dig into your deck more so with the draws. We've seen Volcanic, not Scattershot, but the other one, Shell, and just add 2 shells and then boom, pitch them. But you do have to pay life points for that, so keep that in mind. But the one I think is really interesting that's coming around is Shadal's. I think what's cool about this one is it can be a draw, because if you do Squamata or just hard draw Beast, you just go for Beast and draw a card. Great. That's the same thing as doing the Brawn thing, just draw and it's fine. Or you could go for utility, and what we've seen a little bit of is you play probably 1 or 2, well, probably 2 Squamata. I don't think you need 3. A Beast for the draw, and then you could also play something like a Dragon or the Nef Shadal. Genius, I think, is the name. Nef Shadal, when it's pitched, targets a monster on the field and it can't activate its effects till the end of the turn, so that's kind of cool. Even playing into boards, that kind of forces a negate. Or you could potentially just set one of your quick plays, and now it becomes an interruptive card if you had a Shadal in hand. And Dragon, same thing. Out Floodgates, out Back Row, whatever you want. That's pretty powerful as well. And it's just cool. It adds more utility than just drawing. Oh, searching an extra discard in a Crystal Beast and a field spell that's like fine for the deck. I think it's actually like a lot more utility. I think it's a lot more interesting. You do have to play the 1-ups where like if you draw them, that's just what you have. And like sometimes the Genius isn't going to really be doing anything. Sometimes the Dragon's not going to have any targets. But at least having Squamata and Beast in there is guaranteeing you something, at least a draw no matter what. So I like this package. It's a cool one. There's a lot of different packages to consider. Dangers is another one that could be a thing, but for now, these are pretty cool. So yeah, that's pretty much what I want to talk about today. Just a bunch of trends going on in the OCG that I noticed and thought were pretty cool. Wanted to talk more about. I want to look up a bunch of these rogue decks because like a couple of Unchained decks did make some work. Something like... what I just saw it. Rescue Ace actually has a couple of tops already with their new support. Like some cool stuff. I'd love to take a look at, but it's so hard to find OCG deck lists sometimes. But yeah, really cool discussion. I want to know your guys' thoughts on a lot of those cards. Where do you land on them going into the new format? I think that's going to be a lot of consideration. A lot of those cards are like side deck, potential main deck cards, depending on what you're worried most about going into the new format. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that stuff. But I'm out of here for today. Thank you so much for watching as always. Subscribe to the channel for more stuff from your boy down the line. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.